Hi, my name is Max and I'm a bamboo flute player working for the BCMG. This video is to give a little bit of background about the bamboo flute and some guidance on how to compose for it. The bamboo flute is a woodwind instrument with thousands of years of history, originating from the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia, countries such as India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. More recently, it has become used also in the musical traditions of other countries from across the globe and has really branched out and become truly a global woodwind folk instrument. And here's a little example of what it sounds like. First of all, here is some of the basic and essential information about how the bamboo flute works and how it is played. Like the orchestral or classical flute that we are all familiar with, it is a transverse flute, that is, it's held to the side of the player when they play it, and the player blows the air from an embouchure formed by the shape of their lips across the embouchure hole to produce the sound. Unlike the classical or orchestral flute, because this is a wooden flute and it doesn't have the same sort of lip plate that the classical or orchestral flute has, its default sound is a perhaps gentler tone, if you have a listen. Although it is still possible to play with that harder edged, stronger tone that we are more familiar with from the classical or orchestral flute. But just like the orchestral flute and indeed other flutes from across the world, it has the same potential for short and long sounds being performed by the player depending on how long they blow for, and these sounds being separated and blown separately, usually started with the tongue, or being joined together in phrases which we call slurring. Here's an example of tongued notes. Here's an example of those same notes being slurred, joined together. And whilst we couldn't start notes without the tongue for fast phrases, like I played earlier, we can also start perhaps longer notes or notes used in longer phrases without the tongue. Notes are changed and moved between on the bamboo flute by lifting or covering the fingers, covering the 6 finger holes on the instrument. The instrument has a range of 2 octaves of a major scale. Additionally, other chromatic notes can be played by half covering the finger holes. Here's an example. Whilst each bamboo flute only has a range of 2 octaves, because bamboo flutes come in many different sizes, this actually gives you a wide range of pitches from low to high to work with. Here are a few examples. This is a low bamboo flute in B. That's B just below middle C. The flute you've already heard me play is an E flat. That's an E flat just above middle C. And this bamboo flute, much smaller, is one that's in B flat. That's B flat almost an octave up from middle C, so giving you a much higher, almost piccolo type range. Therefore, the things to remember about the basics of the bamboo flute when writing for it are that on it you can play short or long notes and phrases. They can be detached using the tongue, or they can be joined together, which we call slurred. But it might be worth pointing out that the slurred phrases tend to suit the sound and the characteristics of the instrument a little bit better. When writing for the instrument, please make sure that your composition fits within 2 octaves of a given major scale. Most players, like myself, have many different pitches and sizes of instruments, but common runs which you would write for would probably be instruments in C, D, E flat, F and G major. And as I said, you can also use the other notes of the chromatic scale in your composition, but please collaborate and chat to the player you're working with to check that the particular notes you've chosen to use are actually playable and usable on the instrument in the sort of situation and context that you've written them for. As we've discovered, the bamboo flute has open finger holes rather than keys, and this allows the player to actually add touches and ornaments to notes that are being played in a particular way, and it's a defining sound of bamboo flute playing, both in the Bansuri tradition and in many other bamboo flute traditions. Here are some of the main ornaments that you could use. Feel free to use any of them in your composition. First up, we have the note bend, or glissando, or slide, or in Bansuri terminology known as meand, where we go from one note to the other by sliding our fingers slowly off the instrument, making the note change gradual rather than the sudden movement of a finger moving on or off. Let me give an example. This is me going from the 3rd degree of the scale to the 4th by use of the glissando, or the meand. You can go up or down the flute that way. You can move the distance of more than one note. So here's me going from the 4th to the 6th degree of the scale. And here, using a technique which is not just found in the Bansuri tradition, but is also found in the Chinese Dizi bamboo flute tradition, here I'm going from the 4th degree to the 2nd degree of the scale, again using a glissando or note bend. We also have the technique of the grace notes on the note below the one that's being played by tapping the finger on and off the hole that's adjacent to the one that's being played. Therefore, if I'm playing the 4th degree of the scale with 3 fingers, I'll really lightly tap my finger on and off the hole adjacent to it, so incredibly briefly sounding the note below, but not trying to make that note sound as a proper note, and trying to make that note sound almost like an effect, or using that note percussively so I can actually create a rhythm. Again, this is a technique found in folk flute traditions across the world, known in Indian Bansuri playing as the Khan, but then over in the bagpipe traditions of Scotland and Ireland, it would be called the tap or the strike, for instance. It sounds like this. And perhaps it could add a shape and colour to a longer note. Almost morphing into what we would know from classical music as a trill. As you can hear, sounding quite distinct when done as it should be done. But crucially, also it's a way of articulating, resounding the same note. So rather than me having to tongue that note, the 4th degree of the scale, rhythm, the same rhythm, using my finger, doing the strike, the tap, the calm on that note. And then furthermore, again, using the finger hole adjacent to the note of the one you're playing, you can again use your finger on that hole, but not striking all of it, colouring the side of it, doing a sort of trill which just shades the edge and the beginnings of the tone of the note you're playing. It's a sort of microtonal oscillation. Again, we'd find this technique in lots of different flute traditions. In the Bamboo tradition, it's known as andalan, but again, it's a common colouring technique that you can play on wooden flute traditions the world over. In a way, it's really adding something like what Western classical flute players would use to colour the notes they're playing, which would be the vibrato. And of course, we can also do the conventional vibrato from the diaphragm on the Bamboo as well, again, to add colour and shape to a note. We can also add colour to the notes by sounding the note above it really briefly. What we could think of as a grace note in the classical music tradition, and would perhaps be known as a cut in some Western European folk music traditions, and is known as a gamak in the Indian Bansuri tradition. And again, it's the same idea as the tap on the note below, that's taking a particular note such as this, the 5th degree of the scale. I then really briefly sound the note above, and this just adds initial colour to the sound. Then if I combine both the tap below and the cut above the main notes, we get something else, which is again found in the Indian Bansuri tradition and is known as murki, and would be found in many other wooden flute traditions from across the world. And it's a sort of a note cluster around the main note you're sounding, which adds a lot of colour. We can also add colour to the notes by doing what is very familiar to Western classical instruments, which is Western classical flutes, that is, which is diaphragm vibrato. That's vibrato from our breathing apparatus inside us, and this adds sort of colour and shape to the note, as you can hear. And finally, to finish a phrase, to finish a note, to finish a particular sort of musical sentence that the player has produced, there can be a little fall off right at the end of the long note, and just some stopping blowing. My fingers are just shading over a few of the holes below the note in question, just to add a sort of almost like a pianissimo downwards gliss at the end of a sound. There are also other techniques, not just found on bamboo flute traditions, that can be used on the bamboo flute as well. As I mentioned earlier, there can be the sort of equivalent to the classical music trill. There can be sort of aggressive, almost slap tonguing, which adds a really percussive effect in the way that it's played. There can be the use of harmonics, when we overblow a note from its root to the next octave above, and then from that we overblow to the next fifth above that, and we get a different quality to that same high note which we'd otherwise play in the conventional way. Here I'm taking the root of this flute, the root notes, and I'm going to blow it from the root up the octave above. And then here, when I go beyond that, I get the fifth above that, which really has a very different quality to if I played the fifth above that conventionally. And if I stay blowing the flute like that and move around there, I can play through a few notes in that area of the flute and just get a bit of a different timbre to them. And finally, there is sung multiphonics, when I will sing as well as play the same notes that I'm blowing on the flute and get a sort of jazzy, kind of bluesy, funky sound. And very finally of all, there is double tonguing, like one would do on the Western classical flute. That's where, by using a different formulation of tonguing, forming two different tonguing actions, the tongue behind the front teeth, we can actually tongue much faster and again get a much more sort of fast rhythmic effect. Here I am tonguing, double tonguing. Here then, to sort of demonstrate all of those different techniques I've outlined, is a short improvisation by me. As I said at the start of this video, the bamboo flute has its roots in the music of the Indian subcontinent, countries like India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, but it can also be used in many different musical traditions across the world and is equally at home in them these days. Therefore, if you're going to write for the bamboo flute, if you want some inspiration about some of these musical traditions, here's a little example of some of them. First of all, to recap on the Indian sound, the bansuri sound of the bamboo flute, this would be where a slow improvisation would begin exploring the notes of a particular rag, that's a particular type of scale, and the player would take some time exploring, moving up and down the instrument, using lots of the ornaments I outlined earlier in order to explore and colour these notes before the improvisation would begin to build up in intensity and rhythm until it broke out towards the end into a popular folk song using the same notes of the scale that had already been improvised in earlier. So let me give you a little example of this. Now these improvisations can often last many minutes, 5s, 10s, even 15s of minutes. So I'm not going to spend that long. I'll just finish up with the bright song that comes in at the end of all this. And then the bamboo flute is now a staple instrument in folk music traditions in Western Europe, across Europe and in North America, playing folk music from all sorts of different backgrounds, Irish, Scottish, East European, and then even travelling all the way back to the far east of Asia into China. Here's an example of all of those. An Irish jig. A Scottish strathspey. Folk dance from Macedonia called a kopanica. And then a traditional Chinese song called the Dance of the Owl. We've now reached the end of this video. I hope it's been of some help to you in getting you used to the sound of the bamboo flute, how it works, and some of the things it can do. I'm sure if you do some research, you can find out more about it online. Equally, if you have more questions that you'd like to direct towards me, please get in contact with the BCMG and they will pass them on to me. But just to finish with, and to reiterate some of the key points to remember as you write for the bamboo flute, its range of 2 octaves. Please write inside the range of 2 octaves of a given major scale. Please check with the person you're writing the music for that they have a bamboo flute in the pitch that you require. Please allow enough time for them to breathe in the phrases and the musical lines that you write. We flute players aren't superhuman and we will need to breathe at some point in the music. And please have a deep dive into all the music you can explore played on the bamboo flute to get your head really into the sound of the bamboo flute and therefore be as inspired to write for it as I am to play for it. Thank you very much.